Bibliophiles of the internet, today I'm back to share my July wrap-up. Comparatively, July was a bit more chill reading-wise than June, but I still read a lot of really great books, 12 of them to be exact, and so I still have a lot to talk about, so let's get into it. I decided to start off the month with a bang because the first book I finished in July was my arc of The Bewitching by Silvia Moreno Garcia, which I actually listened to as an ALC courtesy of PRH Audio. The audiobook is read by Gisela Chipe, and this book recently came out on July 15th. This is a sort of paranormal fantasy story that's also a multi-generational story. It follows three women across three different time periods as they encounter reoccurring instances of witchcraft. The anchoring character of the story is Minerva, who is a graduate student studying the history of horror literature with a focus on a famous female writer in the genre known as Beatriz Tremblay. It turns out that Beatriz attended the same university that Minerva is currently attending, and she discovers journal entries and an unpublished manuscript that imply that Tremblay's most famous novel, The Vanishing, was inspired by true events. In Beatriz's time at the school, her roommate mysteriously vanished, and Minerva is beginning to believe that these disappearances are happening once again, and that the same evil force that stalked Tremblay is still haunting the campus. Content warnings for some depictions of death, graphic injury, and dead animals, references to disappearances, experienced ableism and use of ableist language, some sexual content including assault and harassment, and some references to the manipulation of animal corpses, animal sacrifice, and blood sacrifice. Unless you're new here, you already know that Silvia is one of my all-time favorite authors. Her style, her range, her chameleon-like ability to mold herself to whatever genre she chooses never fails to fascinate me, and unsurprisingly, I really enjoyed this. It's been at least a couple of years since Silvia has written something horror adjacent, and I feel like this is a very different take on horror compared to what we've seen from her in the past. But what's consistent from her in that space is that she approaches horror in a way that's very slow boiling. Nothing overtly grotesque or scary or even untoward happens in at least the first half of this book. It's a very gradual build, so to get to the payoff you need to have a little bit of patience. As someone who loves multi-layered storytelling, stories that braid together multiple timelines or generations, and historical fiction, especially historical horror, I was captivated the entire way through. Yes, it's a very gradual build to get to the witchiness and creepiness promised in the title and in the synopsis, but it's that disruption of the character's sense of normalcy that really drives home the unsettling parts to begin with. Thematically, I feel like the story is speaking to the horror that is forgetting our roots, forgetting where we come from, being forcibly distanced from the power of land and homeland and culture by the seductive power of colonialism and assimilation. The story is sort of exploring how we give power to what we believe in, the kind of thought or mindsets that we subscribe to, the ways of living or being that we either knowingly or unknowingly endorse. That's where a lot of the conflict and discomfort in the story is stemming from, and the characters are fighting to reconnect with the truth of their history and really with the truth of themselves. All that said, while I don't think it's necessarily a failure of craft when you can predict where a story is going, who the bad guy is, or what the big twist might be, I will say that I found some parts of this story to be overly predictable, and I found the villain to be a bit too mustache twirly for my taste, especially towards the end, which did impact my sense of satisfaction or catharsis. But I still found this to be incredibly worthwhile. I definitely recommend it, especially if you're a fan of this author's work, and I gave it 4.25 stars. Shortly after that, I finished Coffee Shop in an Alternate Universe by C.B. Lee. This also recently came out from Fierce Reads on July 1st, but I was kindly sent a galley by the author herself. I would describe this as a cozy adjacent YA sapphic fantasy story. It's following this overachieving type A teenager named Brenda who is desperately trying to submit a scholarship application right as the deadline's about to pass, which is of course right when there's a massive Wi-Fi outage. So she's looking for absolutely anywhere to connect to the internet, and she stumbles into this cafe that she's never seen before, and that's where she meets this really cute, really charismatic barista named Kat. The two instantly hit it off and exchange numbers after agreeing to go out on a date together, but when Brenda leaves the cafe, little do either of them realize that they're actually from two overlapping universes that are not meant to be connected. So they might have to work a little magic, bend a little time, and even find an interdimensional portal if they want to go on that date. content warnings for some mentions of parental death and grief, and some descriptions of anxiety and anxiety attacks. Also worth noting, both characters are sapphic. Brenda is coded as demi-romantic, and she is also canonically ADHD. This is such a fun story and also such a creative spin on a contemporary fantasy. I will say I get why it's marketed as cozy fantasy, but I don't entirely agree with that label for this story. It definitely has a sense of coziness at times, especially as these two characters pursue their courtship across universes and spend quality time with each other, their family, and their friends. But this story actually has an underlying plot with incredibly high life or death stakes. But tabling that for the moment, I really love the world building of this story because it's not just about a modern day Los Angeles with a portal to a completely separate fantasy world, but rather it's a modern day Los Angeles layered over a fantasy version of Los Angeles, and I love how the author brings those two versions of the city to life. The way magic works is also a really fun touch because it's almost like magical coding. You have to build in certain parameters and restrictions when you're composing a spell, and whether or not a spell works is not only dependent on having the proper materials and framework, but there's also a magical component to belief and conviction. The sapphic yearning between Brenda and Kat is so incredibly decadent. I love the relationship, the chemistry, the warmth between them that was already incredibly strong when they first met, but gradually grows into something really beautiful as the story progresses. On paper, they're so different from each other. One is a chronic overachiever, the other is a chronic troublemaker and underachiever, but they're both grappling with other people's expectations and struggling to be seen and loved for who they truly are and who they want to become themselves. And so it's just really endearing that they both actually make that space for the other person to be themselves. And thematically, I just really appreciate what the story is doing. It's exploring aspects of human connection, especially in relation to building and respecting community. And it also has a lot to say about the inheritance of generational trauma and how we continue passing the buck to younger generations and setting the expectation that they will miraculously find ways to save us, which is so incredibly unfair. So it's touching on a lot of ideas that I deeply value in regards to how we break those cycles, how we imagine new futures for ourselves, and how we work together to forge new pathways and new possibilities. I just thought this was really lovely and fun and imaginative. I had a great time with it and I gave it 4.25 stars. Then I picked up my galley of The Golden Boy's Guide to Bipolar by Sonora Reyes. I was sent a review copy by the author themselves, but this one comes out fairly soon on September 16th. This is a queer, contemporary, coming-of-age story. It's also a companion novel to The Lesbiana's Guide to Catholic School, but this book is following Yami's younger brother, Cesar, who's always been considered to be the golden boy of the family. He's super smart, he gets really high grades without even trying, and that's what makes it even more difficult for him as he struggles with his mental health. He was briefly hospitalized and kept under medical watch before the story begins, and as the story progresses, he's also having to contend with a possible bipolar diagnosis. But again, as the chronic overachiever that he is, Cesar believes that he has all of this under control, and he believes he's ready to contend with his queerness, coming out, and trying to win back his ex. Content warnings for descriptions of experienced ableism and internalized ableism, some instances of bullying, explorations of religious trauma and religious bigotry, including references to conversion therapy, depictions of self-loathing and negative self-talk, references to deportation, brief non-graphic references to suicidal thoughts and ideation, depictions of underage drinking, vomit, and drunkenness, depictions of both manic and depressive episodes, and some sexual content. I think you can tell just from the content warnings, but I'm not going to sugarcoat anything and just tell you that this is an incredibly difficult and heavy book to read at times. It's told from a first-person perspective, and it's about a character who is deeply struggling with his mental health, who is not making good or safe choices for himself, and actively being self-destructive in a lot of ways. So it's not always an easy book to read, and I think if you're struggling with any of the things that Cesar is working through, maybe this is not the book for you. But that doesn't mean it's not worthwhile, and that doesn't mean it doesn't have pockets of joy or that it's not building up to something hopeful by the end, because it does, and it is. But with that caveat in mind, I think the way the story is structured is so incredibly smart because each chapter is modeled off a different symptom that Cesar might experience as someone with bipolar disorder. So things like paranoia, anxiety, isolation, hyperactivity. And what I really respect is that there's no linear trajectory to those experiences, and the story is really committed to showing the truth of that reality. Mental health and mental diagnoses are not cut and paste, one-size-fits-all experiences. The reality of those diagnoses look different for everyone, and because it's a lifelong experience and journey, there's no working around the inconsistent ups and downs. I think so many neurotypical people especially have this misconception that people who struggle with mental illness just have to get a diagnosis, start going to therapy, maybe take some meds, and then once they do those things, they can establish some level of relative stability for themselves. When in reality, getting a diagnosis and accessing support and resources is not only a privilege that's not available or accessible to everyone, but they're also not these magical fixes. They're just pieces of the puzzle. They're one of many tools that are available to those navigating mental health. And sure, they might make things better or easier, but that doesn't mean you won't ever struggle or that you won't have bad days. And I really appreciate how this story is brutally honest about that experience. I deeply respect it for that, and I appreciate how the story shows Cesar really struggling to work through all of those things and all of those complex emotions for himself. And I also love what the story has to say about how allowing ourselves to love other people is actually one way that we show love for ourselves. Because if we pour into our community pours back into us. And if we have the capacity to give and show love, then we also have the capacity to receive love in return. This is a really fantastic companion to the Lesbiana's Guide that has so much value and so much to offer. I highly recommend both companion books in this series, and I also gave this one 4.25 stars. After that, I finished up a series by picking up the audiobook for The Brightness Between Us by Elliot Schruffer, which is the sequel and finale to The Darkness Outside Us. The audiobook is read by James Foey. I actually can't say what this second book is about because it would completely spoil the first book, so I'll just give a quick overview of the first book, which is a sort of sci-fi thriller set in the distant future when humankind is trying to establish a new colony in the far reaches of space. And the first spacefarer they sent on this mission has sent back a distress beacon which has been intercepted back on Earth. The main character, Ambrose, has been specially trained and selected for this rescue mission, and the story begins when he's already pretty far along in the depths of space, but he has no memory of the launch itself. And even though he was told this was a solo mission, he's realizing that he may not be the only person aboard the ship. Content warnings for references to child death and animal death, descriptions of graphic injury and violence, and some fade to black sexual content. I'll try to keep this brief because again, I can't go into too much detail, but I was very impressed by this sequel. I don't know if this installment was conceived upon writing and publishing the first book, but either way, just considering the sheer ambition and scope of the first book, I had no idea where this sequel could possibly go. But this is an incredibly successful follow-up. It doesn't quite have that same sci-fi thriller edge that the first book has, but it does still have pretty intense stakes. Plus, it also gives us some unexpected POVs from Earth, which is something that we didn't really get to see at all in the first book. So I feel like this second book has all the intensity and ambition that we saw in the first book, pretty much pound for pound, but it's taking a completely different tact. And I also love how both books in this series put a refreshing spin on the concept of fated soulmates. It plays with connection across time and distance in really interesting ways. And most importantly, it really made me think about the concepts of queer futurity and temporality in so many different ways. Again, I don't want to get too specific, but there's kind of a split timeline in this book, one in the distant past and one in the distant future. And as disparate and completely disconnected as those two realities are, it's fascinating to see the ways they overlap and interact with each other, especially in ways that you wouldn't expect. The story made me think a lot about how impossible it seems sometimes to envision what the future might encompass, and how we can even possibly make it to the future when so much about the world feels overwhelming and utterly hopeless. It's easy to throw our hands up and not care about anything, to give in to the urge to burn everything down and leave nothing for those who come after us because it just feels pointless. But it's so much harder and so much more worthwhile to build pathways forward for our future selves and future generations. And going back to that idea of queer temporality, so much of what we do now, what we build now, and what we save now is what makes the future even possible in the first place. So the way the story shows that interconnection and interplay between past and future, decisions made in the past rippling outwards towards the future, is an incredibly beautiful thing. It's an incredibly queer thing as well. I do think the first book is slightly stronger than the second, but I still thought this was absolutely fantastic, and I gave it 4 stars. I took a bit of a hard pivot after that and listened to my ALC of Love is a War Song by Danica Nava. PRH Audio kindly granted me access to the audiobook, which is read by Kayla Garcia, and this recently came out from Berkeley Romance on July 22nd. Danica Nava is an Indigenous author, and this is her second romance. It's another Indigenous romance about a young Muskoka pop star named Avery Fox who's trying to make a name for herself in the music industry and taking every opportunity that comes her way. But when she has the chance to be on the cover of Rolling Stone, her team dresses her in this highly inappropriate and offensive war bonnet. Obviously, there's immediate backlash online, especially from those in Native communities. So Avery's mom, who also is her manager, decides that Avery should take a little hiatus and go keep her head down until everything blows over. So Avery is sent to stay with her estranged grandmother in Oklahoma on her ranch. There she meets the handsome ranch hand Lucas Iron Eyes, who could not live a more different lifestyle compared to her. But the two of them begrudgingly strike a deal to help each other out. Avery will put in the work at this ranch and also help to raise funds to save the ranch, and in exchange, Lucas will help her learn more about her Indigenous heritage and also how to survive on the ranch. Content warnings for experienced online harassment, sexual harassment, and death threats, references to anti-Indigenous sentiments including anti-Indigenous slurs, some references to family estrangement, brief references to death and grief, some references to past experiences of drug and alcohol addiction, and some explicit sexual content. Also worth noting, Lucas is canonically dyslexic. This was a really sweet and charming romance. Danica's first book was an incredibly funny and endearing office romance, and I think even though this is a totally different kind of romantic dynamic, she's able to put her unique stamp on another classic kind of romance trope. Chemistry, of course, is a huge part of what makes a romance actually work, and Avery and Lucas absolutely have that in spades. In fact, I think what makes their sort of hate-to-love dynamic feel grounded and worthwhile is the fact that they're also deeply connected, not only by culture, but also by community and family. And while this story has all the trappings you would expect from a good cowboy romance, I also appreciate the discussions it's able to have about the complexity of claiming Native identity. Far too many people think of tribal enrollment as the be-all end-all of quote-unquote valid Native identity, and there's this conversation happening in the story as to whether Avery should just submit her enrollment paperwork to silence the haters and the doubters, which would then give her license to continue making Native art as she sees fit. But one of the many things that the traditional enrollment process, blood quantum quotas, etc., don't take into account is cultural inheritance and a living relationship with the Native nation you're trying to claim. So I really appreciate the story showing how Avery is genuinely trying to reconnect with this family, this community, this tradition that she's never known. And the story is really about how there's no straightforward checklist when it comes to deciding who is Native enough or not Native enough. The story is showing the cultural value in respecting and participating in community that actually sees you, recognizes you, and claims you back. So there's a lot of worthwhile stuff happening in this story. It's very much a fun, endearing, tropey romance, but there's also deeper discussions about culture and history happening beneath the surface that I very much appreciated. Overall, I gave this 4 stars. I took yet another hard pivot after that and finally picked up Blood Over Bright Haven by M.L. Wong. I listened to the audiobook, which is read by Moira Quirk. This is a high fantasy story with some sprinklings of dark academia. It's about a mage named Sayona who's dedicated her entire life to studying magic in hopes of becoming the first ever woman admitted to the high magistry. When she does end up achieving her goal, she realizes her challenges have only just begun because her male colleagues do not like her and don't want her to find her footing, and they even go so far as to assign a janitor as her lab assistant. This janitor, Tamil, is actually an immigrant who's one of the only survivors of his nomadic hunting tribe, and he has no magical training to speak of. But as unlikely as this relationship between mage and outsider might be, as the two begin to work together, they actually end up uncovering an ancient secret that might just threaten the existence of magic itself. Content warnings for graphic depictions of death, injury, blood, gore, and violence, some depictions of vomit, brief but graphic references to self-harm ideation and suicide ideation, explorations of xenophobia, religious bigotry, colonialism, and colonial violence, some use of ableist language, depictions of sexual assault, descriptions of mass violence, and references to child death and forced sterilization. This one turned out to be a little bit tricky for me, which is kind of unexpected because I've been very vocal about really wanting to read this book and predicting that it might become a new favorite, and overall overall, while I do think the aesthetic, the magic system, and the thematic work are fairly impressive, I find that it does falter a bit in execution. But I did find this to be a fascinating and immersive fantasy world, and I do deeply appreciate what it's trying to accomplish. This is definitely a powerful commentary on how the experience of oppression does not make marginalized folks exempt from knowingly or unknowingly perpetuating oppression themselves. That is an incredibly important, nuanced, and timely message, and I appreciate how that's very clearly and unambiguously woven throughout the story. This is not the kind of fantasy story that tiptoes around its politics. It's loud, it's purposefully uncomfortable, and it's in your face. So I definitely fuck with what this story is all about, what it's really trying to do, how it's committed to showing Sayona's journey and realizing that she and the society she not only loves but works to actively further has played a direct hand in both exploiting and exterminating quote-unquote lesser peoples for their own benefit. That's a really hard pill to swallow, and we see how that reckoning impacts Sayona on every level you could possibly imagine. And ultimately, I do respect the story's underlying message of how it's not enough to just be horrified by the state of the world, how allowing ourselves to stall in a state of helplessness is a privilege, and how the much more pressing question is not how did we get here, but rather how are we going to get out of here. Where the story falls short for me personally is not only that it's incredibly heavy-handed and even clumsy at times, but so much of it ends up feeling like colonial violence 101. And more importantly, I think the story makes far too much space for colonizer tears and colonizer guilt, as opposed to action against colonial violence. It does get there in the end, to be fair, but there's just too much space on the page for colonizer guilt. The story also tries to insert a sort of romantic dynamic between Sayona and Tamil, colonizer and colonized, in a way that just doesn't feel good, believable, needed, or authentic. It just doesn't add anything to the story or to their relationship. Intellectually, I fully understand why this story is written from the point of view that it is. I understand why it does the things it does and takes us through all the stages that it does. And while I respect its politics and its message, I think it could have been so much stronger in so many ways. So in the end, I gave this 3.5 stars. After that, I picked up my early copy of The Possession of Alva Diaz by Isabel Cañas. Berkeley kindly sent me an early finished copy, and this comes out fairly soon on August 19th. Isabel Cañas is a Latina author and a master of blending horror and romance, and that's exactly what this new book does once again. It's also historical horror because it takes place in Mexico during the 1700s when plague is ravaging Alva's home in Zacatecas, which causes her to flee with her wealthy parents, her fiancé, and her future in-laws to an isolated mining town for refuge. But any sense of safety is fleeting at best because Alva immediately starts experiencing strange hallucinations, sleepwalking, and even violent convulsions that seem to have no cure and no source. So she finds herself tangled up with Elias, her fiancé's estranged brother, as she fights for her life while contending with the occult, the Catholic Church, and long-kept family secrets. Content warnings for references to child abandonment and estranged parents, graphic descriptions of illness, instances of graphic violence, injury, and blood, some use of ableist language, and some sexual content. Also worth noting, Elias refers to himself as half Spanish and half Muslim. At this point, it's very clear that Isabel Cañas has my fucking number. Her aesthetic, her style, her attention to paralleling horror with thematic messaging never fails to resonate and never fails to impress. There's drama, there's semi-forbidden romance that isn't gross, there's a twisting of religious imagery in a way that's unsettling and horrific, and she just really knows how to drive home exactly what's at stake. In all 3 of her books so far, this author is very committed to taking the concepts of colonization and colonial violence, which don't always show up in visible or obvious ways, and makes them into a literal force that the characters have to face down and contend with. I think she finds ways to do that are so incredibly fascinating. And what this particular story is doing is exploring the concept of possession, obviously, but not just in a straightforward way where a person's body is being occupied or controlled by an evil force. The reason why Isabel Cañas' work is so powerful is because she takes a concept and extrapolates it from so many different angles. Here she parallels paranormal possession with the concept of ownership, the kind of ownership that men and the patriarchy exact enacted over female bodies during this time period, the colonial concepts of possession and ownership when it comes to who is entitled to land, regardless of the land's history or its context. So that idea of something or someone being forcibly and violently controlled, the sense of violation that comes with not being able to exact your own agency or being cut off from expressing yourself truthfully and authentically, is what's being iterated over and over again in multiple different ways as the story progresses. Elias is also a fantastic romantic hero and co-lead for this story. The desire he feels for Alba especially is so incredibly captivating because there's an interesting push and pull between when she is the woman he knows and loves and when she's being controlled by this heinous, violent force. That interplay between desire and fear is something that really tickles my brain because it's almost a testament to that experience of deeply loving something, whether it be family or country or a way of life that simply does not love you back. There's truly so much to consider here. This is a dark, enticing, seductive, incredibly well thought out story that I just loved every single second of. I thoroughly recommend Anything and Everything Isabel Cañas writes, and I gave this 4.5 stars. I took another dramatic pivot after finishing that and actually finished up another series by picking up my e-galley of Gabriela and His Grace by Liana de la Rosa, which comes out from Berkeley Romance on August 26th. This is the third and final companion novel in the Luna Sisters romance series. It's a Latina historical romance companion series following 3 Mexican sisters whose wealthy parents send them away to England in order to keep themselves safe as the French occupation of Mexico continues. And while there, the sisters are supposed to be making connections with the London nobility, presenting themselves as worthy ambassadors for Mexico, and securing possible alliances for their country. This story is following the youngest sister, Gabriela, who is tired of being in London and being constantly hounded by British suitors who only care about her sizable dowry. And because the French occupation is beginning to die down, she decides to return back home to Mexico without consulting her parents. Little does she know, the Duke of Whitfield has a ticket aboard that same ship to Mexico as he travels to go inspect a mining venture that he hopes will finally refill his family's dwindling coffers. But could their close proximity ruin all their best laid plans? Content warnings for explorations of occupation and colonization, experienced racism, colorism, and misogyny, some expressions of anti-Indigenous sentiments, depictions of parental estrangement, as well as verbally and emotionally abusive parenting, and some explicit sexual content. Also worth noting, all 3 of the Luna sisters are considered to be mestiza, which means one of their parents is Spanish and the other is an Indigenous Mexican. This is the book in the Luna Sisters companion trilogy that I have been waiting for since day one, since book 1. These 2 characters have been bantering together in the background of the first 2 books in a way that made it obvious they were endgame for each other, and I have to say that the payoff here is so incredibly delicious. It was worth every single second of the wait. Even though I wouldn't consider this to be a perfect book by any means, I thoroughly enjoyed every second of the story. I would say this third romance is much more slow burn compared to the first 2, which is exactly how I prefer my romance, so I think the romantic arc is perfectly paced in that sense. I just love these 2 characters, and I really love them together. As the youngest daughter, Gabriela is really struggling to live up to the expectations her older sisters have set. They're both incredibly successful, they have found respectable husbands, they're independent and starting their own lives and their own families, and because she doesn't have those obvious markers of quote-unquote success, it's hard for her to see herself as accomplished. That's why I love her relationship with Sebastian, because he's not only respectful, but he holds Gabriela in incredibly high esteem, even when they don't see eye to eye. And along with support from her sisters, he's helping her to realize that the only validation she needs is her own, and that there's so much good about her that is deserving of love. I think that's why this particular relationship resonates with me even more than the ones in the first 2 books, because Gabriela is given space to learn how to love herself before she's ready to love someone else and also accept love from someone else. And the story is also touching on how, yes, it's important to show up and fight for those who may not have power or a voice, to fight for the people we love when they need us the most. But it's also important to recognize that we should include ourselves in that fighting for ourselves is also a necessary skill to have. Not only that, but the story is also making a powerful statement about how the people who truly love us are the ones whose only expectation is that we be ourselves, the ones who allow us to shine the brightest and give us space to grow into anything and everything we can imagine. All that said, I do think the story slightly falls apart towards the end. While I don't mind a good marriage of convenience trope, I felt a bit cheated in regards to how these two characters finally got together, and it didn't feel quite as celebratory as I wanted, and as I think a finale in a companion series really deserves to be, just because of the circumstances. Things do eventually work themselves out, we get to that happy ending, but I do think the ending was a bit messy, and things that had been carefully set up were kind of steamrolled at the end just for the sake of drama. So for those reasons, I gave this 4.25 stars. Then on a whim, I finally picked up They Can't Kill Us Until They Kill Us by Hanif Abdurraqib. I listened to the audiobook, which is read by the author himself. This is an essay collection that is a fascinating blend of memoir, music commentary, and even cultural criticism. In the most simplistic terms, this is a collection of essays where Hanif writes about his experiences going to concerts and experiencing live music, and then he finds ways to connect that back to the ways we process love, loss, grief, injustice, and the resplendent turbulence of our own humanity in so many ways. Content warnings for explorations of racism, anti-blackness, Islamophobia, and misogyny, descriptions of violence, mass death, domestic terrorism, racist killings by police, and police brutality, and some brief references to suicide, death, and grief. I'm going to keep this brief because there is no way I'm doing this collection justice, but these essays were absolutely outstanding and totally bowled me over as I knew they would. While this might be the first full-length book I've read from Hanif Abdurraqib, this is not the first time I've read his work. I've read many of his poems and articles and essays. It's with that knowledge that I can say from my gut that he is an incredible talent, a once-in-a-generation kind of writer who is able to tap into an incredibly deep sense of humanity and excavate that humanity by using topics and narrative pathways that you wouldn't expect. Like in this collection, on the surface, these essays set out to explore the deeply communal and almost spiritual experience of listening to live music and what it feels like to surrender yourself to the moment while being surrounded by people who are having an equally personal and cathartic experience, who are connecting to something meaningful in the same way that you are in that moment. But at the same time, it's also a deeply powerful treatise on grief and loss. While those topics seem almost unrelated at first glance, the collection is gradually revealing how those moments of connection and release that are unique to live music are some of the moments that we feel most alive. And when we think about what it means to live, we also have to think about what it means to lose the people we love. Who isn't in the room and who doesn't get to claim those pieces of humanity, those experiences of being alive simply because of their circumstances? Who doesn't get to have that, and why aren't they there? There's something so powerful, so earnest, so vulnerable, so undeniably human about these essays in a way that I cannot explain. Hanif's writing demands to be experienced. It's urgent, it's insightful, it's electrifying to see the connections he's able to make and to see how he understands the world's interconnectivity. He is nothing short of brilliant, and I couldn't give this collection anything less than 5 stars. I did another 180 after that by picking up my e-galley for House of the Beast by Michelle Wong, which just recently came out from Harper Voyager on August 5th. This was pitched as being perfect for fans of Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood, which I am. This is a dark fantasy debut about a young girl named Alma who grew up living in poverty with only her mom and never knowing who her father was. But when her mother falls suddenly and violently ill, she decides to write to her estranged father and beg for help. What she doesn't know is that she belongs to House Avera, one of the 4 noble houses that serve the gods and are imbued with their powers, and her father is a vessel of the Dread Beast, the god of death. Alma sacrifices her left arm to the beast in a ceremony that binds her to the house in exchange for her father facilitating her mother's care, but she also finds that she has a unique connection to her god, a monster and eldritch being that takes the form of a beautiful prince that only she can see. Growing more and more resentful of how her father has trapped her as a pawn in his own political machinations, Alma vows to seek vengeance and makes a deal with her eldritch god, exchanging her body and soul for his destructive power in hopes of destroying House Avera and everyone connected to it. Content warnings for explorations of parental death and grief, depictions of depressive episodes, descriptions of blood, graphic injury, and graphic violence, and brief depictions of animal injury and animal death. Listen, I'm a very simple person. If I hear a story is about being possessed by an eldritch god, humans making Faustian-like bargains and exchanging their souls for power and vengeance, then I know that story is for me. And this book absolutely delivers on that front. This story imagines an incredibly rich and enticing fantasy world where the realm of humans and the realm of gods overlap and even depend on each other in really interesting ways. The best way I can put it is to say that the world building on display in this story really made me lean in. I wanted to read more about it, I wanted to learn more about it, and the more layers that got pulled back as the story progressed, the more satisfying it felt. Alama is also a deeply fascinating character. She is tortured and divided in so many ways because she wants nothing more than to avenge her mother's death, but she's also struggling to balance whether she can exact her own form of vengeance while still being the person her mother raised and while still being herself. And then there's that million-dollar question of how can she even know who herself is when she's not only been molded and manipulated by her father's house for so many years, but when she also houses an all-powerful god in her body who has his own desires and thoughts and plans. At the end of the day, this story really made me think a lot about the internal wars that we wage against ourselves, especially when it comes to surrendering to either cynicism or optimism, or even the instinct to either self-isolate or connect. Alma knows that she is a terrible person who's done terrible things and will continue to do terrible things, but does that mean that she's doomed to never be anything else or ever want anything else for herself? She also knows that she's kept herself safe by being alone with her God, by pouring into that connection and nothing else. But she's also learning that even though that relationship is integral to understanding who she is and who she's still becoming, there's also value in learning to recognize and listen to your own voice. Thematically and aesthetically, I really do appreciate everything this debut sets out to accomplish. Though I do think it's a bit rough around the edges in a way that you would expect from a debut fantasy novel. The relationships Alma has with characters who are not her eldritch god could have been stronger, and the story could have stood to be tightened up in a few places. The pacing and structure is a little bit off from time to time, but I still think this is a fantastic debut. I would love to read more from this author in the future, and I gave it 4 stars. Then I finally got a chance to pick up The Incandescent by Emily Tesh. This came out in May from Tor Books, who kindly sent me an e-galley, but I got a finished copy myself and I listened to the audiobook, which is read by Zara Ram. This is a contemporary fantasy story about Dr. Walden, who is the director of magic at a boarding school in England that caters to young students who are powerful magicians. During the day, she teaches A-level invocation to a small group of students, and she also works to secure the school's wards and boundaries in order to keep everyone safe from demonic incursions. However, it's possible that the entity Dr. Walden most needs to keep everyone safe from is herself. Content warnings for descriptions of thematic violence, some sexual content, and brief non-graphic references to child abuse. I found this to be such a delightful surprise. I think when you hear that a story is about demons, possession, and occult magic, you have an idea of what that's going to look like. And I feel like this story is able to subvert those expectations and be surprisingly charming and lighthearted instead. In terms of structure, it's also a refreshingly slice-of-life story. There's not really a big bad, there's not really a single overarching conflict that's driving the story, but rather it's just following Dr. Walden, her students, and her colleagues as the school year progresses. And I think that's actually a big part of this story's charm because, of course, it has magic and demons and imps and spellcraft that our world doesn't have. But the reader is able to feel grounded in those unfamiliar things because the story is tapping into the everyday foibles of academia and teaching. It very much feels like a long-form love letter to academia, not in a way that romanticizes what is often an incredibly thankless, demanding, and challenging field to work in, but in a way that celebrates the academic professionals that show up for their students year after year and keep doing their best to arm the next generation with knowledge, even in a field that ironically does not facilitate that process. I personally think that academia is a deeply flawed system, and sometimes this book captures that and sometimes it doesn't. But I think the story is really excavating what can be so integral and foundational about academia academia when the system works and when the people within it are actually allowed to succeed. So I definitely found the story endearing and heartfelt in that sense. There's a genuine sense of love and camaraderie between Dr. Walden and her students, her peers, the whole campus, which was just really fun to read. But I do think one of the book's biggest missteps is in the underlying sapphic relationship in the story. I feel like Dr. Walden and her love interest don't get enough meaningful time together on the page. And also, because the story isn't driven by a singular overarching conflict, the transition going from that easygoing slice of life tone into something much darker and much more serious doesn't always feel seamless. But again, I did really enjoy this. I would love to read more from Emily Tesh in the future, and I gave this 4 stars. And lastly, I picked up my July Patreon pick, which was The Death of Jane Lawrence by Caitlin Starling. I checked it out from my local library, and I did a tandem read with the audiobook, which is read by Mandy Weston. This is a mixture of gothic horror and fantasy. It's about a young lady named Jane who is obsessed with numbers and calculations. She does the accounting for her family, which brings her immense joy and satisfaction. However, because young women are not typically trained or hired to do that work professionally, and because she is of marrying age, all she wants is to secure a loveless marriage of convenience that will allow her to continue her work in peace. So she learns of a young reclusive doctor named Dr. Augustine Lawrence who is unmarried and owns his own surgery practice that could use someone tracking the accounts. In a twist of fate, he actually agrees to her proposal on the one condition that she never stays the night at Lindridge Hall, the crumbling family manor located outside of town. Content warnings for graphic depictions of blood, gore, surgery, and severe medical trauma, brief description of miscarriage, references to parental death, some instances of drug use, and some fade to black sexual content. To be completely honest and transparent, I still have a few hours left of this audiobook as of filming. I'm filming a little bit early before the end of July just because I don't have a ton of time in my schedule this week, so I won't be able to give a final verdict or star rating, but I can say that so far I'm really enjoying this. I think this story is absolutely fitting the bill for what a good gothic horror story should be. It has all those classic elements of bleakness and darkness, mysteriousness, a suffocating sense of distrust, a moral and emotional battle between humans and evil forces of their own creation. I just feel like Caitlin Starling is hitting all the notes when it comes to tone, style, and execution. This is another one of those stories that makes me want to lean in more and more with each passing page. The way the story gradually moves from a feeling of hopefulness and even possible budding romance to something much darker and far more twisted and complex than the heroine could have ever predicted is really well done. And again, I can't really speak to how these ideas either land or don't land by the end, but at least so far, I'm really loving how the story is positioning this destructive evil force as something that stems from the character's own sense of shame and guilt. It's their moral failings, their past mistakes that sort of give this evil power and life in the first place. So when they're thinking about how they might banish that force for good, they're really having to contend with how they can banish their own internalized shame and stop giving literal power to those feelings of guilt. In some ways, the story is tackling the concept of hubris, at least in the sense of having the urge to blame yourself for every horrible thing that goes wrong, when in reality, mistakes and even tragedy are often evidence of society or a larger system failing along multiple points. So there's a lot of really fascinating things happening so far. I love the tone, I love the writing style. I think it perfectly accentuates all the deeply strange and unsettling things happening as the story unfolds. Almost every twist and turn has been a surprise to me so far, and I genuinely have no idea how this story is going to end. But I hope that it does stick the landing. There you have it. Those are all the books I read in July. And as always, I would love to hear from you if you've read any of these books yourself, or if you plan to. Drop your thoughts in the comments down below, or let me know your favorite book that you read in July so we can discuss. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself and others, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page.